Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, and may I begin by thanking Lucy and the Aldeburgh Festival for this invitation to be part of this study day. It's a great honour and pleasure to have the opportunity to speak. I've been asked to talk about Myfanwy Piper's contribution to Owen Wingrave as Britain's librettist, particularly in relation to the film, the first performance of Owen Wingrave. And as you know, it was commissioned by the BBC in 1967. And as you also probably know if you heard Lucy's talk last night, it was sold in advance to 12 international television companies. So when it was transmitted on the 16th of May, 1971, within a week it had been viewed in America, Austria, Belgium, Denmark, France, Germany, Ireland, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, Switzerland, and Yugoslavia. And I gather from Lucy that it was 250,000 audiences saw it when it first was transmitted. This is extraordinary, and Britten therefore knew at the very start that his opera would reach a very wide audience. So he needed a story that, in his own words, would be personal and powerful, and which would suit the medium of television. And he chose this story by Henry James, this short story, Owen Wingrave. And I think it gave him a vehicle for several things, not just his hatred of war and commitment to pacifism, but of course those interests were to the fore and exacerbated while the opera was in the making by the invasion of Czechoslovakia and the continuation of the Vietnam War. Well, 15 years, it's a long time, had passed since Britten had previously worked with Myfanwy Piper on The Turn of the Screw. And as you've seen in this lengthy interval, there'd been the creation of Midsummer Night's Dream and Noah's Flood and other things, and more recently, the 3 church parables. And those parables, of course, achieve expressive concision through the use of rigorous limitations. And I think in Owen Wingrave, Britten wanted to transfer that intensity to the screen. But at the same time, as Paul Kildea observes in this year's programme book, the score is full of radiant colours and ideas that look back to the scores of the 1940s rather than the cooler pieces of the 1960s. Britten was, however, wary in his return to opera in this way that what might happen when a musical drama is transferred to a televisual medium with its intimacy. There it is in our drawing rooms, each of us watching it in an atomized way, and also a medium that offers potentially much greater flexibility. Thus, while working on this opera, he told Donald Mitchell, the drive forward of the music, the singing of the tunes, the elaboration of the ensembles must never be forgotten. So, why did he turn again to Myfanwy Piper in his choice of librettists? Well, chiefly, of course, because he had worked with her before on that other Henry James text, The Turn of the Screw. And just see if I get up the score for that. And also because she had, in this opera, managed to extract, with the necessary concision that a libretto requires, a development that matched James's unfailing sense of theatre. The Turn of the Screw is Britain's most tightly organised opera. I think that's by a consensus opinion. And as Wilfrid Mellors once wrote, no opera of Britain, or perhaps any composer, is so claustrophobically close-knit. Secondly, I think Britten wanted Myfanwy because of her understanding. The suggestion that he might make an opera out of The Turn of the Screw had been her idea and had come to Britten via Peter Pears. Almost certainly, she had recognised that it could become for him a vehicle through which to explore the conflicts within himself. Similarly with Owen Wingrave, its presentation of this family with its fixed and unthinking moral stance was abhorrent to him and was something that had both personal as well as universal meaning and relevance. Myfanwy had read English at Oxford, and she was a great fan of Henry James. When Britten mentioned James's short story, Owen Wingrave, on a visit to Fawley Bottom, let's have a look at Fawley Bottom, where the Pipers lived, small hamlet outside Henley-on-Thames. When Britten mentioned Owen Wingrave, Myfanwy immediately recollected that he had spoken about it to her at the time that he was embarking on his war requiem. She immediately understood its significance for him. When asked if she would write the libretto, she immediately concurred. I said yes, she recalled, and that was it. Well, finally, a third reason why he chose Myfanwy Piper, let's have a look at that coming, was that she had learnt from his advice not to colour words, but to let the music do that. And when read on the page, her libretti may seem a little flat. The libretti, I think, do come across a little flat, but when combined with music, with Britten's music, they express very precisely a character, an idea, or a dramatic situation, and they make possible those sudden changes of mood as the drama segues through the various scenes to the final climax, particularly in Owen Wingrave. In the course of working on this opera, and later when working again with Britten on Death in Venice, Myfanwy came greatly to admire Britten's theatrical invention, and he was aware in the case of Owen Wingrave that the way in which the story begins in the Henry James version does not suit an opera. Owen, as you know, is the last in a family with a long military heritage. Both his parents have died, his father in the Afghan wars, and at Paramore, the ancestral house, home to his aunt Jane Wingrave and his grandfather, Sir Philip Wingrave, the tradition of militarism is grimly upheld. So James's story opens with his pronouncement that he's going to turn his back on this, on a military career, and tells this is the opening paragraph, gives this announcement to his tutor Coyle. Britten thought this was too abrupt. He asked Myfanwy to invent a scene in the Crammer where Coyle prepares a small and select number of young men for the army. He also told Myfanwy that he had envisaged a way to handle this musically. And so Myfanwy began reading widely, immersing herself in the Napoleonic Wars and the Indian Mutiny. She went to the London Library. She borrowed Clausewitz's On War, that 3-volume systematic philosophical investigation of the subject. And we glimpse something of the result of all that reading in this opening scene, which we will now have a look at.
Helmets, Napoleon's right.
I see, sir, I see.
They crossed the Golbech River, their troops massed in the defiles between the two frozen lakes and the stream. General Von fell on them from above. Result, disorder, panic, defeat.
And the losses, sir?
Napoleon, 8,000. The Allies, 14,000 killed, wounded, or drowned. And 18,000 taken prisoner. As you can imagine, Napoleon was radiant. Thank you, gentlemen. That will be all for this morning.
Didn't they love it? And so they showed it's a glorious life. Ah, you beauty, how many vile heads, vile foreign heads have you rolled into the dust? Something, you dread choice in violence. What is the enemy for but to be routed and killed? You forget,
You are the enemy too.
I'm sorry you're losing a bit of colour with all the lights on the thing, but anyway, you get the music and the story's gist. This is not... I hope you've got the sense of all the sort of military reading that went behind that little excerpt, and it continues on as that scene goes on. Of course, what that reading gave Myfanwy Piper was an better understanding of the vainglorious militarism of the Wingraves, but it also helped infuse her vocabulary and the language that she gave to her characters, and it also provided her with very useful quotations. She copied out a letter from Wellington that he wrote to Lady Shelley, and here is the passage. I hope to God I have fought my last battle. It's a bad thing to be always fighting. While in the thick of it, I am much too occupied to feel anything, but it is wretched just after. It is quite impossible to think of glory. I am wretched even in the moment of victory, and I always say that next to a battle lost, the greatest misery is a battle gained. And of course, you will probably recognize that that final sentence is a quote that Owen uses in this first scene, a little bit after what we've just watched, where it crystallizes a dramatic moment and terminates his argument with Lechmere. Of course, elsewhere in Myfanwy's libretto, military metaphors come readily to hand, thickening the atmosphere and pointing up dramatic irony. There were other places, aside from the opening scene, where Myfanwy Piper had to expand on James's story because it lacks the kind of build-up, the slow build-up of suspense and psychological ambiguity that we find in The Turn of the Screw. For instance, in Henry James's story, Coil is what we call the chief focalizer for Owen. In other words, most of the story is told from his standpoint. And in the short story, we receive a hint of what the renegade Owen has suffered after his return to Paramore, to face the weight of his family's disapproval, when Coil and his wife arrive only 2 weeks later on a visit, and Mrs. Coil observes to her husband that Owen looks 5 years older. And Coil himself remarks, "I couldn't imagine that, nor that the crisis would be quite so perceptible." Well, that was in James, but of course Myfanwy in her libretto felt it necessary to invent the drama behind that crisis. And it climaxes in the scene where the individuals or the residents individually and then in unison sing the words, "How dare you," uniting with those 3 words. Before this, Myfanwy evokes, I think, the 3 Furies, or perhaps the Greek Erinyes, through the characters of Owen's formidable aunt, Miss Wingrave, together with Mrs. Julian, who has been taken in by the Wingrave family with her daughter Kate, as Mrs. Julian's husband has died in battle, as has her brother, who is, of course, was the fiancé to Miss Wingrave, hence the sort of extended family that has formed at Paramore. And in the eyes of these 3 women, Owen deserves no hero's welcome. So she decides that Owen should have Miss Wingrave, who you see here, Owen deserves no hero's welcome, and suggests to the ladies that they should all withdraw so that he can speak first to his ancestors, which very visibly in the first television production are present through this series of rather grungy portraits. Now, before we look at this clip showing this passage, a word about Miss Wingrave. The casting of Neil Bartlett's new production, particularly I felt in relation to Coil, was terrific. But has anyone ever beat Sylvia Fisher's performance of the original TV version of Miss Wingrave? She has the demeanour exactly right. If you look back at Henry James's story, where a conversation between Coil and Lechmere goes as follows. Coil has just told Lechmere that Owen has objected to the military profession. "Why?" asks Lechmere. "It has been the profession of all his family." "Their profession?" replies Coil. "It has been their religion. Do you know Miss Wingrave?" "Oh, yes, isn't she awful?" young Lechmere candidly ejaculated. "She's formidable," replied Coil, "if you mean that, and it's right that she should be, because somehow, in her very person, good maiden lady as she is, She represents the might, she represents the traditions and the exploits of the British Army. She represents the expansive property of the English name. Rather wonderful Jamesian ending there, which I think probably refers to the name Wingrave. So here is Sylvia Fisher as Miss Wingrave, and after the three Furies disappear, Owen arrives at Paramore. Notice the use of military metaphors as he defines his position.
Wingraves are soldiers, Wingraves are soldiers, they go when they are called. Protectors of their country's rights, protectors of God's given truth. Always and everywhere, always and everywhere, everywhere. Thus will it be with Owen. He will listen to the house. He will listen to the house. He will listen to the through the lodge gates. Why, he looks almost dejected. How dare he? We'll not go down, ladies, until he's well inside. There'll be no hero's welcome. Let him speak first to his ancestors.
Face them, all of them, the living and the dead. Hello! No one to greet me, not even Kate. No one here. All silence, silence. Yes, good soldiers in the mist, we're told, keep silence, silence. No friendly murmurs, no scream of pain betray their position to the enemy. The enemy, how strange, here in my own house I stand, an enemy. I say, there is everyone.
Further glimpses into Myfanwy Piper's working methods and the progress of her libretto can be found in her notebooks. She scanned James's text carefully for telling words and phrases, and the recurrence of scruples gave her the word which becomes the focus for the scornful climax directed at Owen in the dinner party scene, where, as before with the How Dare You, the Wingraves and Julians unite in their stand against Owen and freeze into identical attitudes. One knows that there are people like these, Myfanwy wrote of the Wingraves, dehumanized by their own strict and immovable code. At the same time, she was aware that James had manipulated them in such a way that they were in danger of becoming caricatures. And for this reason, as others have pointed out, she filled out the characters of Owen's military tutor, Spencer Coyle, and his wife, giving to Mrs. Coyle especially a depth of feeling that offers the necessary human relief. After a period of gestation, she began writing the libretto, and she admitted to Britten that her first draft of Owen Wingrave, and I quote, was a depressing mixture of styles and very verbose. But, she adds, I feel that it is not right to try to prune and shape it now, as I might prune away the bit that you might find suggestive or even inspiring. I sometimes worry when scholars go to the archives and look through the drafts of her libretti and dismiss ones that are probably in that shape. They were purposefully in that shape at that stage, I would suggest. I think she was aware at this sort of stage that her approach was instinctively to think in terms of theatre, but before long, both she and Britten began to give much more thought to the medium of television. BBC Two had begun broadcasting on the 21st of April 1964, but it could not be obtained in the small hamlet of Fawley Bottom. This may explain why up till then Myfanwy had found the few things she'd been on television rather depressing. But she was not averse to the medium and now watched it with interest to discern its possibilities. Britten, on the other hand, did not own a television until 1973, that's 2 years after Owen Wingrave was transmitted, when Decca gave him one for his 60th birthday. Myfanwy tried to keep him up to speed. The popular programmes she wrote, the news and sport, are very well done. The awful mess are those that try to be a bit highbrow but still keep the million viewers. Plus ça change. Nevertheless, both that took the medium very seriously. Their first discussions, Myfanwy Piper claims, dwelt upon the visual rather than the verbal presentation of dramatic points in this work. And in one of her notebooks, she lists strong visual images in the actual story. The opera actually begins with an emphasis on the visual, the camera focusing one by one on the 10 family portraits, before ending with Owen, who appears in the scheme of things like an 11th portrait. And in addition, 4 orchestral interludes were devised, all with visual matter in mind. One of them was introduces the scene which is actually split between Owen, who's gone into the park, and instead of reading Goethe, as he does in the Henry James story, is reading from Shelley's Queen Mab. And simultaneously, Coyle has gone to visit Miss Wingrave in her residence in Baker Street, which and the camera cuts between the two. So there's 2 scenes that are happening at the same time. You fade into one, and one fades out and the other comes in. Now, what Myfanwy's intention was that both should look out the window, or Cohen in the park notice there's a vision of horse guards riding past. And then in Owen's mind, these would eventually be turned into turmoil and fall off their horses and so on. But it couldn't happen. It was, as Myfanwy admits, perhaps too complicated for television. And so instead you get this rather miserable effect of Miss Wingrave looking at a print of soldiers riding, and Owen, the television team did manage to find eventually a rather dim clip of the Royal Military Police mounted troop crossing a field at Aldershot. And it's terribly disappointing, and you get the point through the cutting, but it's very, very clumsy. Both composer and librettist were keen to go beyond what could be achieved in the theatre and do things that can only be done with television or film. And of course, one of those, now a cliché of course, is the use of close-up to convey interior thought. But of course this works perfectly in the dinner party scene, where the general conversation is intercut with a moment of inner reflection, and the tension between the spoken and the unspoken is at its height. The camera, by means of close-up, reinforces that change of mood, which of course is also expressed in the music. It's an example, I think, of Myfanwy Piper's bold adaptation and her acute sensitivity to Britten's needs. But overall in the television film, the effects were kept simple, as Britten wanted people to keep in mind that this television opera would eventually transfer to the stage. Nevertheless, I still often find the dinner party more effective on film than on stage, though it is very impressively done in this new version at Snape Maltings. She was on holiday in Pembrokeshire when Myfanwy conceived the ballad song sung by the narrator at the start of Act 2. I remember it took me ages to do, she told Roderick Dunnett, ages and ages, and I worked on it a lot in the cottage in Wales, the whole of that ballad, the Wingrave boy ballad. And of course it returns at the end of the opera when the final verse is sung, its final line, echoing the final line in James's story. The opera, as you know, ends with Owen's death, and the death caused by supernatural causes behind it. And as you probably know, this is one of the most contentious things about this opera, the relationship between the supernatural and the natural or more everyday world. The problem, I think, lies initially and more obviously in Henry James's story. Virginia Woolf was one person who objected to the Henry James story. She noted that the characters in it are endowed with a great deal of stir and importance without these qualities leading anywhere. She's very severe about this story. She continues, "We seem to be settling in for a long, absorbing narrative, and then, rudely, incongruously, a shriek rings out. Poor Owen is found stretched on the threshold of the haunted room. The supernatural has cut the book in two. It is violent, it is sensational. But if Henry James himself were to ask us, 'Now, have I frightened you?' we should be forced to reply, 'Not a bit.'" And this is her crucial point. The catastrophe has not the right relation to what has gone before. And this, I think, a number of other people, Peter Evans, the musicologist, among others, have tried to also argue in various ways. What did Myfanwy feel? Well, she remained adamant in her belief that this ending, rather downbeat ending, and that is right, and that had there been more optimism, it would have been aesthetically wrong and unsuited to the psychology of the family. Something I can't go into here is the very interesting information that you gain about James's thoughts on this ending if you read his play based on the short story, The Saloon, and all the extensive advice to stage instruction that comes in it, which does give some clue that he clearly thought that Owen was somehow victorious. Whether that comes across in the opera is something we might wish to debate. But the important thing about the second act is that Myfanwy provided Britten with the platform for his pacifist views. And in that hymn of peace, where are we gone now, which occurs in Act 2, Scene 1, we find something that really acts as a coda to Britten's War Requiem. Many drafts of this were produced before it was structured, as Arnold Whittle has observed, like a psalm or canticle. And when set, I think, to Britten's music, it transcends conflict with a moment of sudden beauty and, of course, importantly, peace.
I was surrounded with love, lost in hope,
Spoiled with admiration, and all for the image they made of me, for the man they planned to make of me. How I am nothing, I bid you all farewell.
in peace. I have found my image, I have found myself. In peace. not lazy, but vigilant. Peace is not acquiescent, but searching. Peace is not weak, but strong, strong like the bird's wing, bending its weight in the dazzling air. Peace is not silent, it is the voice of love.
I'm sorry to cut it off there, but time requires. Well, in February 1970 at the Red House, Britten played through the whole of Owen Wingrave to Myfanwy, and she was greatly moved. The opera, of course, benefits from superb casting, as I hope you've noticed. And in November 1970, Myfanwy was present through the 3-week rehearsal at the Maltings, about which perhaps we'll hear more later, and the 8 days filming that followed. I enjoyed every minute of the month at the Maltings, she afterwards wrote to Britten, in spite of the grind, tedium, frustration, and the curious grandmother's footsteps of progress of TV production, or Snakes and Ladders if you prefer it. It was marvellous, she says, to hear the whole work grow and to get to know the singers and watch their enthusiasm, forbearance, not to mention yours. I do think it a great work, and I am proud to be associated with it. She and John Piper returned to Aldeburgh on the 16th of May 1971, when Owen Wingrave was simultaneously seen and heard in 13 countries, and to watch it with Britten and peers on a television rented specially for the occasion. Well, in later years, her enthusiasm for this opera, I think, in comparison with the other two that she did with Britten, became slightly modified. Yet she had a help to achieve a musical drama in which each incident and emotional development is carefully structured and fitted one into the next, either by means of contrast or out of narrative necessity. And 30 years later, when a second television film of Owen Wingrave was made for Channel 4, it perhaps did better things with regard to the actual direction and production, but it is still, I think, that first film that with its predictable sets, its over-harsh studio lighting, its rather wooden direction, nevertheless, that, for me, of the two films is the best that displays the dramatic power of this opera, but also perhaps something of the tact and sensibility that Myfanwy desired. Thank you. Well, if you think there's time,
just maybe just take one. Just a short one. Thank you so much, Frances, for a fascinating insight into Myfanwy Piper's collaboration with Britten on this opera. Tea is imminent, but we do have time, and I think we have, is Heather here with the microphone? We do have a roving microphone. If anyone has a question that they're dying to ask Frances just now before we have tea. Yes, I think we have a taker. Let's just take a moment.
I heard that Myfanwy Piper was interested in making Kate a bit more human a character as well, to develop her somewhat like she did the Coils, to make her a bit less harsh as she appears, but then Britten opposed her in this. Do you know whether she had any particular ideas about how to do that?
Well, she does introduce a moment in the conversation when it's just Kate and Owen alone.
That moment, yes.
Where they reflect on their childhood games in the park and elsewhere, so on. So there's a moment of quietness and not that constant battle that is such a feature of this opera. But yes, and of course, as you probably know, Janet Baker disliked the character of Kate and wasn't very happy doing it. And I think this is why Mrs. Coyle is so important, I think, to try and balance that. Peter Evans thought this attempt to give more human detail to the characters, to make them more three-dimensional, was a mistake because it made the contrast with the supernatural even more difficult. But I don't think Myfanwy overdoes it, and I think she mostly, her central was to get the militarism come through them all, which certainly does, because it's a really raspingly fierce opera to sit through, isn't it, really? But no, I can't add more to that, I'm afraid, on Kate.
Thank you.
One very quick question before we break. If not, we will break for tea.
Can I just ask, I can do that enough, I think. At the exhibition in the Red House, you see 2 pages of the libretto, and there are a number of corrections and indeed lines added by Britten. And I wonder how typical this was, and in fact how much Britten himself contributed to the libretto.
Well, as you know, Britten believed very much in collaboration, and he'd begun turning to Myfanwy Piper for advice on the use of a word or phrase even before she became his librettist, because the moment that John Piper became perhaps Britten's chief designer after Peter Grimes with The Rape of Lucretia, and from then on designed all his main operas, aside from this one for the television, Myfanwy sat through all the rehearsals, so she was very familiar with the way he set words to music, and he'd quite often lean over to her and say, is that the right word? Can you think of an alternative? And as mentioned in the article on Crozier in the program, this year's program, he turned to her for advice on the libretto of The Little Sweep, which was rather alarming for Crozier at the time. So he obviously respected her judgment, but there was a lot of toing and froing. As you know, Britten liked to have his librettist sitting at his elbow and working so closely that the exchange could happen fluidly and frequently in that way. And in Turn of the Screw, Myfanwy Piper was living the other side of the country and had 4 children and was looking after the laundry and buying the fish and so on. And he found this rather frustrating, but a lot was done on the phone. I mean, he would sing things over the phone. And of course, he would make visits and play through whole scenes and everything. So there was a lot of collaboration. She was much freer when it came to Owen Wingrave to get in contact with him and be with him. But I think it's very, very difficult to be certain in various places within these operas who thought of what. There are certain moments where you can definitely pin it down from a letter or something that says, certainly Britten would have suggested a change of word to her words, a change to her, draft libretti, yes, without doubt.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody.